Analysts say that one of the most pressing issues in Africa's airline industry is the disparity in travel prices compared to global averages. Studies have shown that airfares within Africa tend to be higher than those in other regions, even for shorter distances. This discrepancy can be attributed to several factors, including high operational costs, limited competition among airlines, and inefficient regulatory frameworks. As a result, air travel remains out of reach for many Africans, and as a result, stifles economic growth, hindering regional integration. For more on this, I was joined by Ogaga Udjo, an independent African aviation strategist and consultant based here in Washington, D.C. Ogaga, thank you so much for joining us today. It's good to see you. So you just traveled back from South Africa to DC.
Yes, I did.
How was your flight?
It was good. It was good. It was
Welcome
good.
to the show.
Thank you so
much. I know we had you
much.
before. Today we want to talk about the aviation industry in Africa. They say that Africa contributes only 2% of the global air traffic. Let's talk a little bit about the state of the aviation industry. First of all, why are flights so expensive?
So I think I always like to start with a bit of context when talking about the industry structure. So essentially, aviation by virtue, it's a global industry, right? But different regions have different dynamics, different performance, different business models that are at play. With regards to Africa, that is a very good and strong metric that you mentioned. 2% of global traffic comes from Africa. That's the share that we represent. And this has really been the case since 1990. And it hasn't changed much in that regard, in that it's been stagnant from that period. However, currently Africa accounts for about 18% of global traffic, of world population. So with those kind of two contrasting elements, African aviation has had certain structural issues that have continued, many that have improved, but overall, some of the key structural things African aviation deals with is lack of connectivity, which is most of factors from the supply side. We have a lot of state-owned carriers, some that have a varied performance. We have limited supply in that regard because there are certain routes that have more frequent services versus others, and we have different rates of urbanization, which of course affects the uptake of demand. On the other hand, we also have a high operating cost environment. All airlines have to deal with jet fuel and those costs. However, in many of our economies, those costs are actually denominated in currencies that are not local, which also has the additional of currency expense, and exchange rate, and that impacts the operations of businesses. So there are a whole host of factors. To your very direct question as to why it's so expensive to travel in Africa, but from a context perspective, African aviation is at a smaller scale compared to other regions. It is not as pervasive as you would find in markets such as America or Europe, and we are not integrated into a continental transport system, which is generally enabled by some sort of economic concentration or integration.
There was some sort of a continental agreement, to open airspace to carriers from different countries. What's the status of that?
So this again falls under the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. There are effectively 4 pillars around what an integrated economy looks like. What you're referring to, the single African air transport market. Of course, another pillar is the continental free trade area. We then have initiatives such as, the African passport or visa-free travel for Africans, as well as, the role of financial institutions. Those are the key 4 pillars around what an integrated economy in Africa looks like. The single African air transport market is really a new commitment for an initiative that has been happening since the 60s with the organization, with the old OAU, or the precursor to the AU. And this has really looked at how we liberalize African aviation and really use aviation as an enabler of economic development. In 2018, a new declaration and commitment was signed to almost fast track and implement the Yamoussoukro decision. And the status is varied across different countries. There has been improved implementation overall. There are various metrics of what we look at, liberalizing air markets, having bilateral air service agreements in place that are open to liberalization across jurisdictions. It really is varied.
What would the liberalized air market look like?
So it depends, and there's certain factors. One of the most probably contentious ones is ownership, right? In liberalized markets, the notion of foreign ownership is actually quite open, with the principle that, an Ethiopian carrier can invest in another country, and there isn't limitations on aviation. And what you find typically is that aviation has additional limitations on foreign ownership. So one of the big pieces of that is changing the rules of the game around how investors can work across aviation. Another element is what we hear about a lot, which is bilateral air services, right? So the rules that designate how airlines can fly between countries. We all know as Africans, sometimes having to travel multiple places to get to some place in our own continent. That is a function of the agreements called bilateral air service agreements that countries have with each other. And what the Single African Air Transport initiative tries to do is to, essentially alleviate the need for that, and if they are there, have them all standardized so that they promote intra-Africa travel. Africa has no issue when it comes to intercontinental travel, and domestic travel is picking up, but how we trade and travel amongst ourselves, that's where the challenge is, and that's why we're still behind our COVID recovery.
Right. So a couple of years ago, I was in Cape Town, and I met there with this Somali reporter who told me that for him to leave Hargeisa, he had traveled to Turkey or somewhere in the Middle East, and then have to fly to the hub, which Addis Ababa, and then fly to Cape Town. How do you explain those dynamics? Why is it difficult for somebody to find a flight coming from Somaliland or Somalia to come to Cape Town?
Look, I mean, that's the function of many factors. I think, at the most basic level, airlines are demand-driven, and in trying to, really drive for commercial feasibility, airlines go where the demand is, right? And sometimes that means, in order to serve that demand, sometimes that does mean consolidating a different origin and destination points. So from a commercial perspective, that's where airlines, have to play. But I think at a government level, at a policy level, that's where the rules of the game around, how open are our markets in terms of providing services. I think a good kind of in between is what we refer to as fifth freedom traffic rights, which is essentially the rules and laws that allow for airlines such as Ethiopian Airlines, Kenya Airways, even the Middle Eastern airlines to operate, where you have this, consolidating people in one hub, moving them to another country, and sometimes via another country. So those are elements that actually stimulate travel. What we call it's called security. It's not, feasible for someone to have to make multiple stops, because that is costly, but it is also a way of trying to consolidate demand, and that's why countries try and leverage freedoms of the air so that people can travel, even if it means consolidating them via one hub. But it does add cost, and it's also a function of the operating expenses and the operating environment if you are an African aviation operator.
How difficult or easy is it for a foreign investor to come in any market X and establish a carrier?
Again, that also depends, because it's different for countries within the region. Different rules apply. But effectively, there's almost the ownership rules of a country, and then there's the industry, and then there's the certification, right? So, as a foreign investor, one can come into a certain country and invest, but are they able to necessarily start up an airline? There's a whole certification process that goes about that, and different countries have different rules around that. What Satam tries to do is to ensure that African airlines and African countries are able to engage with each other in that regard. Because as we relax a lot of our rules as a continent, that has actually increased in intracontinental investment, but not necessarily stimulated intra-continental investment, and that pertains to aviation as well. But in short, it's a pretty difficult feature to start up an airline in any market.
So you just flew from Pretoria to the US.
Yes.
Which carrier did you use?
So I used Qatar Airways.
Okay.
I do have a bias. I used to work for them as a strategist, but I preferred to...
Did you go through Qatar?
I went through Qatar, and then I came
went through
here.
Doha.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I like spending some time, of course, when you have such a long flight. So that's just my preference.
Absolutely. I found that it's really nice to... I've flown through Doha a couple of times, and I'll go to one of those little lounges.
Exactly.
You pay a little extra money, but
Exactly.
it's really, really comfortable.
Stretch the legs a little bit.
Absolutely. What are some of the top carriers on the continent, and what are some of the things they've done to be successful?
I think a huge feature of African aviation, which is different to other regions, except maybe Latin America to an extent, is that most, essentially the major players in African aviation are state-owned. Other parts of the world that has changed. So the majors, literally represent, states. So of course, Ethiopian Airlines, Kenya Airways, Royal Air Maroc, Egypt Air, South African Airways, although this has reduced over the years. And then we have previous carriers as well. In terms of some of the major players, just from a volume perspective, South Africa does actually have a heavier weight across the region because the size of the domestic market is the largest in Africa. So you have airlines such as FlySafair that actually come up in terms of volume. But what's also important at play is that Africa, like any other market, is host to a range of business models which affects airline market share. So we have, the network carriers such as an Ethiopian Airlines and a Kenya Airways, and we also have the regional carriers such as an Airlink, and then we have the low-cost carriers such as a FlySafair. And those dynamics actually play quite a big role in how airlines perform.
And how do African airlines compete with international carriers, and how do they stay competitive, or how can they remain competitive in this market?
I think there's a lot of I would say givens in aviation, right? It's a global industry and has always been. Additionally, technology has always been the basis of aviation. And with that kind of parameter, I think African airlines, it's a spectrum of performance in terms of competitive benchmarking, but there are many respects where African airlines are, I would even say, better or more competitive than other global carriers. From a safety perspective, that is also the case in that, the region is very strict around safety, and that is, again, regulated at a global level. So in terms of aviation, we have the same regulations at a global level. And when it pertains to particularly safety, those are mostly adhered to. But in terms of, I would say, commercial competition, it depends on the business model. I think that we need to do a lot more around being innovative in terms of e-commerce. But with that said, we also have different channels of payment, such as WhatsApp, which you won't find in some markets. So the network carriers, I would say, compete more fiercely because they have competitive markets, such as Ethiopian Airlines and Egypt Air would compete with an American Airlines or another carrier in a similar competitive market. But at a regional business model level, we also have, I would say, pretty strong competitive benchmarking to other carriers such as, your JetBlues, etc.
I have flown a couple of airlines around the continent, the local small carriers, and in terms of safety, honestly, I would. That was a little questionable sometimes. I remember flying from Lagos going to Accra. I won't name the carrier, of course, but some of the windows were not able to open the shutters. They were, I just felt like the caliber of aircraft that is operating in some of those routes is a little questionable. And you're saying that they are adhering to certain universal rules or regulations.
Absolutely.
But I feel they fall short in some of these things.
I think that there's definitely a service differential in certain markets. And I think that might lead to other perceptions. But from a safety perspective, just to give a quick rundown, countries have to go through these audits that are done globally every year. They also have to have, it's 8 areas of critical safety that are addressed. Yes, from an aircraft age perspective, African aviation uses slightly older planes. I think the average aircraft age is about 23 years, whereas in some markets it's 7 years. But from a safety perspective, that's a different story. I definitely think that there are cases around improving safety capacity that need to be addressed, which is, public information, and that's really critical. But I also think that it's critical to understand kind of what that specific country and that specific airline's performance is, because that information is available to consumers. And I think that it's important to keep on pushing that we don't just have African standards of excellence, these are standards of excellence.
Global
standards of excellence, not just from the safety perspective, which sometimes isn't seen from a consumer perspective, but also from the service provision and value proposition perspective.
How do you see the future of the African aviation industry as it stands right now? Looking at, we are the youngest continent, many of the countries are aspiring to be middle class, so there's going to be a lot of flying needed, at least people flying internally. And I feel like, aviation plays a very critical role in that last mile of, logistics.
Absolutely.
Where do you see the future?
Absolutely. I think that's such a great question, because sometimes, what we see in front of us doesn't necessarily represent where the trend is going. So, aviation globally is expected to be profitable this year. African aviation, together with a couple of other regions, is lagging slightly behind. But what you just mentioned around the key drivers for, the growth story that is Africa, and for the future story that is Africa, the fact that the world economy will rely on Africa in many respects into the decades to come. I think that is enabled by trade, travel, and transport. And where I think we're going is that we are going to see more consolidation of markets and entities. This has happened over the last few years with COVID. A lot of state-owned carriers had to, consolidate, get into partnerships, dispose of assets, bring in private sector. There's a lot of those elements around consolidating more mature airline models. There's a lot of new carriers coming up, a lot of regional carriers that are expanding their markets. But I think one thing that is critical is that we should see and strive for more regional connectivity in Africa going forward. Additionally, the role of technology and digitalization is part and parcel of the African growth story as well. And also looking at elements such as urbanization, the rising middle class that we always talk about, and improved standards of living. These all have a knock-on effect and are also enabled by air transport. And I think that really excites me in terms of the key drivers and signals that we see for the future.
And finally, again, I wanted to ask this question again. I feel like you scattered around it. Some of the top airlines or some of the top carriers, are you able to tell us?
Look, I can definitely tell you by market share, but I mean, the best is also subjective.
Okay, let's go by market share.
So in terms of volume, Ethiopian Airlines is really is the story that we know from an airline perspective. But in terms of market size at a country level, you have countries such as South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Morocco, that are among some of the top countries in terms of a volume perspective, in terms of the size of their markets. But in terms of individual airline market share, that also does track with the countries where I mentioned the Egypt Airs, the Ethiopias, Kenya Airways, South Africans, etc. So in terms of size, basically there are about 10 to 12 airlines that really drive African aviation, and I think a future that's competitive means that should increase more in a rational way, which means that some of those carriers might have to, reduce their market share or align to market
new
forces.
Ones coming too.
Absolutely, not a place of oversupply, but a place of competition, because oversupply is a real issue in the aviation market. But in terms of volume, that's the easy one to answer. But in terms of best, I'll reserve my opinion.
That's a political question.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Ogaga Udjo, our independent aviation strategist. Thank you so much for coming here and joining us today on the show.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate the insights.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
At least 16 African countries, including South Africa, will hold elections in the remaining months of 2024. Voters who go online for political news are risking exposure to disinformation and misinformation. But a new digital ethics organization aims to help journalists and activists identify false and misleading content so they can educate the public. Sahir Kasim brings us this story from Johannesburg in South Africa.
In the upcoming general elections of 2026.
At first glance, this video of Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema announcing that he won't be running in the next election seems authentic, but it's fake. And these journalists in Johannesburg are learning how to spot the difference with the help from a non-profit called Campaign on Digital Ethics, or CODE. Kavisha Pillay is the founding director of CODE.
We're making sure that people are accessing information that is safe and is not going to be harmful, that the technology that we're using is not going to cause further harms to our society.
Working with CODE on this project is Africa Check, one of the continent's leading independent fact-checking organizations. The staff at Africa Check encourage people to send them suspicious content. They're collaborating with CODE to teach the public how to identify fake social media content.
It helps to have not just someone to step in and do some work checking that kind of information, but also to be able to share tips and tricks and techniques for stepping in to stop that spread with anyone.
Community activist Manny Sigomani will be on high alert in the days leading to South Africa's May 29th elections, on the lookout for any fake content that might affect his ward.
I think we're moving into an era where more and more the truth is being distorted, and we kind of need these kind of initiatives to keep people grounded and to keep people responsible.
The Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa has announced it will work with Google, Meta, and TikTok to help safeguard the integrity of the electoral process. Siri Kasim, VOA